Robert Chen sat in the third row of Vienna's most prestigious concert hall, tapping his pen against his leather notebook. He had been doing this job for 12 years now, and honestly, he could usually tell within the first minute whether someone had what it took or not. It was a gift, really. Or at least that's what he told himself every time he watched another nervous teenager walk across that stage. The morning had been long. 7 performers so far, and none of them had impressed him much. Sure, they could play. They hit the right notes, followed the tempo, did everything technically correct. But that spark, that something special that made you sit up and forget you were a judge? He hadn't seen it yet today. He glanced at his watch. 2 more hours until lunch. His stomach growled quietly. And he made a mental note to try that new Italian place his wife had mentioned. Maybe the afternoon sessions would be better. They usually were. The really talented ones always seemed to perform later in the day, as if the competition organizers saved the best for last. His assistant, a young woman named Lisa, leaned over and handed him the next folder. Robert barely looked at it. He'd learned not to read too much into the applications anymore. Sometimes the most impressive resumes produced the most disappointing performances. And sometimes, well, sometimes you just had to trust your gut. Next up is number 43, the announcer's voice echoed through the hall. Elena Kovac from Croatia. Robert heard the name but didn't bother looking up right away. He was still writing notes about the previous performer. A boy from Germany who had rushed through Chopin like he was trying to catch a train. Croatia. He tried to remember if he'd ever had a standout performer from there. Maybe one, years ago? He couldn't recall exactly. When he finally did look up, he saw a girl walking across the stage. She looked about 17, maybe 18. Nothing about her stood out particularly. She wore a simple black dress, the kind you could buy at any department store. Her dark hair was pulled back in a basic bun, and she walked with small, careful steps, like she was afraid of tripping on the polished wood floor. Robert watched as she approached the piano. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and even from where he sat, he could see them shaking slightly. Great. Another nervous one. He'd seen hundreds of nervous performers over the years. Some overcame it. Most didn't. He leaned slightly toward Thomas, the judge sitting next to him. Thomas had been doing this even longer than Robert, and they'd developed an easy shorthand over the years. A look, a subtle gesture, and they could communicate their thoughts without saying a word. "What do you think?" Robert whispered, barely moving his lips. Thomas shrugged, not taking his eyes off the stage. "We'll see. Doesn't look too confident, does she?" Robert shook his head slightly and looked back down at the folder Lisa had given him. He flipped it open, scanning the first page quickly. Small town in rural Croatia. No famous teachers listed. The audition recording had been made in what looked like a school gymnasium, judging from the grainy video still attached to the file. Not exactly the Vienna Conservatory. He sighed quietly. Look. He wasn't a snob. Really, he wasn't. Some of the best musicians he'd ever heard had come from humble beginnings. But there was humble, and then there was unprepared. And something about this girl's application screamed unprepared to him. No major competitions listed, no prestigious summer programs, just a handful of local performances at what appeared to be community events and school functions. On stage, Elena had reached the piano. She stood there for a moment, just looking at it. Robert noticed she didn't have the usual polished confidence that most serious competitors carried with them. You know the type. They walk on stage like they own the place, adjust the bench with practiced precision, smile at the judges with that perfect mix of respect and self-assurance. This girl looked terrified. She adjusted the bench, but her movements were uncertain. She sat down, then stood up again and adjusted it once more. Robert heard someone in the row behind him stifle a small laugh. He felt a twinge of something. Not quite sympathy, but something close to it. He remembered his own first big competition, decades ago. the nerves that made your hands feel like they belonged to someone else. But still, this was the International Youth Piano Competition. If you couldn't handle the pressure of walking on stage, how would you handle the actual performance? Elena finally settled on the bench. She placed her hands on her lap and closed her eyes. Robert watched, waiting. The hall had gone quiet, that particular silence that comes before a performance. Everyone waiting, holding their breath, wondering what would come next. He noticed her hands then. Really noticed them. Even from several rows back, he could see the calluses on her fingers. That was unusual for someone her age. Most young pianists had smooth hands, well cared for hands. These looked like they'd seen some work. Hard work. Robert frowned slightly. Maybe there was more to this girl than her application suggested. Or maybe she just had a side job. Lots of students work to help pay for their education. Nothing wrong with that, of course, but it usually meant less practice time. And at this level, practice time was everything. Elena opened her eyes and raised her hands to the keyboard. Robert positioned his pen above his notebook, ready to start timing her. The first 30 seconds were crucial. That's when you really got a sense of someone's potential. The way they approached the keys, the confidence in that first note, the tone they produced right from the start. He was already preparing his standard feedback in his mind. Technically adequate, but needs more refinement. Consider studying with a more experienced teacher. Perhaps try again in a year or two. He'd given that speech so many times he could do it in his sleep. Thomas shifted in his seat beside him, clearly thinking the same thing. They exchanged another look, this one saying what they were both thinking. This would probably be over quickly. Not terrible, but not memorable either. Just another young pianist who'd aimed a bit too high, a bit too soon. Robert checked his watch again. If this performance was short, maybe they could squeeze in one more before lunch. He really was quite hungry now, and that Italian place was calling to him. Fresh pasta, maybe some of that bread their chef made from scratch. On stage, Elena took a breath, a deep one. Her shoulders rose and fell. Robert saw her lips move slightly, like she was saying something to herself. A prayer, maybe? Or just trying to calm her nerves? Then her fingers touched the keys, and everything changed. The first note hit Robert like a wave. Not gentle, not tentative, but full and rich and absolutely certain. His pen, which had been hovering above his notebook ready to write, stopped mid-air. He blinked, surprised, and looked up at the stage with fresh eyes. Elena was playing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. Robert recognized it immediately. It was a bold choice, maybe even too bold for someone her age. This wasn't some simple Mozart sonata or a safe Chopin nocturne. This was one of the most demanding pieces in the piano repertoire, the kind of music that could expose every weakness, every hesitation, every moment of doubt. But there was no hesitation in Elena's playing. None at all. Robert leaned forward in his seat without realizing it. The sound coming from that piano wasn't what he'd expected. Most young pianists approached Rachmaninoff carefully, treating it like something fragile that might break if they pushed too hard. They played it safe, hitting all the right notes but missing the soul underneath. Elena wasn't playing it safe. She was playing like the music was coming from somewhere deep inside her, like every note meant something personal. There was a rawness to it, an honesty that Robert hadn't heard in years. Maybe longer. He glanced at Thomas beside him. His fellow judge had put down his pen entirely and was staring at the stage, mouth slightly open. Behind them, Robert heard the rustling of programs stop. The usual coughing and fidgeting that always accompanied these performances had disappeared. Everyone was listening now, really listening. Elena's whole body moved with the music. Her shoulders swayed with the crescendos, her head tilted during the softer passages. She looked nothing like the nervous girl who had walked across the stage just minutes ago. That girl had vanished completely. In her place was someone else entirely, someone transformed by the music flowing through her fingers. Robert watched her hands move across the keys. They were fast, incredibly fast during the technical passages, but never rushed. Every note was deliberate, placed exactly where it needed to be. And during the slower moments, those beautiful, aching, melodic lines that Rachmaninoff was famous for, her touch became so gentle that Robert could barely believe the same hands were playing. He realized he'd forgotten to take notes. His notebook sat open on his lap, empty except for the previous performer's evaluation. He should be writing something down. That was his job, but he couldn't bring himself to look away from the stage long enough to write. The music built and swelled, and Elena attacked a particularly difficult passage with fearless intensity. Her fingers flew across the keys in a cascade of notes that sounded like water rushing over rocks, like wind through trees, like something alive and breathing. Robert felt his heart racing along with the tempo. This was the kind of passage where most pianists made mistakes, where the fingers couldn't quite keep up with what the mind wanted them to do. Elena didn't make a single mistake. Thomas leaned over and whispered, "Good God." Robert just nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak. The music shifted, becoming softer, more introspective. This was the second movement, the part that always made Robert think of longing, of something beautiful that was just out of reach. Elena's interpretation was heartbreaking. She played each note like it was a secret she was sharing, something precious and fragile. Robert noticed something then that made him pause. There were tears on Elena's cheeks. Not dramatic sobbing, just quiet tears that rolled down her face while she played. She didn't wipe them away. Maybe she didn't even notice them. She was somewhere else entirely, lost in the world the music had created. And she was taking everyone with her. Robert looked around the concert hall. In the front row, an elderly woman had her hand pressed to her chest, her eyes glistening. A few seats down, a man in an expensive suit had taken off his glasses to wipe his eyes. Even the other judges, hardened critics who'd heard thousands of performances over their careers, looked moved. This wasn't just good playing. This was something else, something rare. Robert's mind raced, trying to understand what he was experiencing. He'd been wrong. Completely, utterly wrong about this girl. His first impression, his dismissive glance at her application, his assumption that she wouldn't be special, all of it had been wrong. And he knew enough about himself to admit that this made him uncomfortable. He prided himself on his ability to spot talent. It was literally his job. But he'd almost missed this. He thought about all the other performers he might have underestimated over the years, all the times he'd made snap judgments based on appearances or backgrounds or the quality of an audition tape. How many had he written off too quickly? How many diamonds had he overlooked because they didn't come in the packaging he expected? Elena moved into a series of complex arpeggios, her hands crossing over each other in a blur of motion. The technical difficulty was staggering, but she made it look effortless. More than effortless, she made it look necessary, like those notes simply had to be played exactly that way, or something essential would be lost. Robert found himself holding his breath during a particularly intricate sequence. His hands gripped the armrests of his seat. He realized with some embarrassment that he was reacting like an ordinary audience member, not like a professional judge, but he couldn't help it. The music had grabbed him and wouldn't let go. Behind him, he heard someone gasp quietly during a beautiful melodic phrase. Someone else whispered something in what sounded like Italian, words Robert didn't understand but whose emotion was crystal clear. The entire hall had been swept up in what Elena was creating. Lisa, his assistant, suddenly appeared at his elbow. She was holding a folder, thicker than the one she'd given him earlier. Robert looked at her questioningly, and she mouthed the words "complete file" while pointing at it. He took it from her, confused. What did she mean, complete file? Hadn't she already given him Elena's application? He opened the folder quietly, trying not to rustle the papers too much. Inside, he found several additional pages that he hadn't seen before. Background information, detailed biography, personal statements. Lisa must have pulled the full record from the competition office. Robert started reading while still listening, his eyes scanning the pages quickly. What he saw made his stomach drop. Elena had taught herself piano. Not partially, not with a little help here and there. She'd actually taught herself, starting when she was 7 years old with an abandoned piano she'd found in an old community center. The piano had been damaged. Several keys didn't work at all. But she'd practiced on it anyway for years, learning to adapt and work around the broken parts. She'd used free videos online, borrowed books from the library, pieced together her musical education from whatever scraps she could find. Robert kept reading, his heart sinking with each new detail. Her father had died when she was 12. Her mother worked multiple jobs just to keep food on the table. Elena helped raise her 2 younger siblings, cooking dinner for them, helping with homework, putting them to bed before she could even start her own studying. And then, late at night, when everyone else was asleep, she would practice. On that broken piano at first, and later when they finally hauled it away, on whatever instrument she could get access to. The school gymnasium piano, a keyboard at the local church. Once, according to these notes, she'd even practiced on a piano in a hotel lobby, playing quietly in the early morning hours before anyone came downstairs. Robert looked back up at the stage, his vision blurring slightly. Elena was still playing, still pouring everything she had into the music. He understood now why her hands had calluses. He understood why she looked so nervous walking across the stage. This wasn't just another competition for her. This was everything. Her one shot. Her chance to show the world what she could do despite everything that had tried to stop her. And he'd almost dismissed her without really listening. Robert closed the folder and set it on his lap, his hands trembling slightly. He felt ashamed. That was the word for it. Not just embarrassed or uncomfortable, but genuinely ashamed of himself. He'd been doing this job for over a decade, and he'd always considered himself fair, objective, someone who judged purely on merit. But that wasn't true, was it? He'd judged Elena before she'd played a single note, based on nothing more than where she came from and what her application looked like. On stage, Elena had moved into the third movement. This was where the piece really came alive, where all that pent-up emotion exploded into rapid, thundering passages that demanded everything from the performer. Robert had heard hundreds of pianists attempt this section over the years. Most of them got through it. Some of them even played it well, but Elena was doing something different entirely. She attacked the keys with a power that seemed impossible for someone her size. The piano rang out, filling every corner of the massive concert hall with sound that was almost physical in its intensity. Robert could feel it in his chest. That deep resonance that only comes when someone truly connects with an instrument. But it wasn't just powerful. It was controlled, precise, every note exactly where it needed to be, even at breakneck speed. He understood now. Those years of practicing on a broken piano, of learning to play perfectly because she didn't have the luxury of a forgiving instrument to hide her mistakes, had given Elena something most pianists never developed. She'd learned to play with absolute accuracy because anything less meant hitting a key that didn't work, meant ruining the entire piece, meant wasting the precious little practice time she had. Every limitation she'd faced, every obstacle that should have stopped her, had instead made her stronger. The broken piano had taught her precision. The limited access to instruments had taught her to make every practice session count. The responsibility of caring for her siblings had taught her discipline. And the loss of her father, that deep well of grief that Robert could hear in every melodic line, had given her something that couldn't be taught in any music school. It had given her soul. Thomas grabbed Robert's arm suddenly, his fingers digging in. "Are you hearing this?" he whispered urgently. Robert nodded, unable to speak. Of course he was hearing it. Everyone in the hall was hearing it. This was the kind of performance that people would talk about for years, the kind of moment that reminded you why music mattered in the first place. Elena's face showed everything she was feeling. Joy and sorrow, triumph and pain, all mixed together in an expression so honest it was almost hard to watch. There was nothing calculated about her performance, nothing held back. She was giving everything, risking everything, letting everyone see right into her heart. Robert thought about his own daughter, safe at home with every advantage he could give her, piano lessons with the best teachers in the city, a beautiful grand piano in their living room that was tuned twice a year. Time to practice whenever she wanted with no responsibilities beyond her schoolwork. And yet his daughter had quit piano last year, saying it was boring, that she'd rather focus on her friends and social media. He'd been disappointed but hadn't pushed her. Music should be a joy, not a burden, he'd told himself. But watching Elena now, he realized there was a difference between having every door opened for you and having to fight for every single step forward. His daughter had never wanted it badly enough because she'd never had to. Everything had come too easily. Elena had wanted it with every fiber of her being. She'd fought for it, sacrificed for it, worked until her hands had calluses and her eyes burned from exhaustion. And that wanting, that desperate hunger to make music despite everything the world had thrown at her, that was what Robert was hearing now. That was what made this performance transcendent. The music climbed higher and higher, building toward something magnificent. Elena's hands flew across the keyboard in patterns so complex that Robert's musician brain couldn't quite track all the individual notes. It was like watching water flow or birds in flight, something that followed its own natural logic beyond simple technical analysis. Around him, Robert noticed that other people had started to gather. The backstage crew had come out into the wings to watch. Other competitors, the ones waiting for their turn to perform, had abandoned the warm-up rooms and were standing in the shadows, staring at Elena with expressions that ranged from awe to despair. How could anyone follow this? What could you possibly play after witnessing something like this? Even the other judges, all 5 of them, had completely abandoned any pretense of professional distance. Catherine, the eldest judge and usually the strictest, had tears streaming down her face openly. Young Daniel, who'd only joined the judging panel last year and still carried himself with cocky confidence, looked like he'd just witnessed a religious experience. And Thomas, steady, unflappable Thomas, who Robert had known for 15 years, was shaking his head slowly back and forth like he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Robert looked down at his empty notebook page again. What could he possibly write? How do you capture something like this in words? Excellent technique seemed absurd. Strong emotional connection was laughably inadequate. There weren't words in the music vocabulary for what Elena was doing up there. The piece moved into a section that always gave Robert chills, a sweeping melodic line that Rachmaninoff had woven through the chaos like a golden thread. Elena played it with such tenderness that Robert felt his throat tighten. This was the sound of hope, of beauty surviving against all odds, of the human spirit refusing to be crushed by circumstance. He thought about what Elena's life must have been like. Coming home from school to care for her siblings, cooking dinner on a tight budget, helping them with homework, cleaning the house, and then, only then, after everyone else was taken care of, allowing herself to think about music, sneaking moments to practice wherever she could find a piano, falling asleep over borrowed music theory books, dreaming of stages like this one, never quite believing she'd actually make it here. But she had made it. Through sheer willpower and talent and refusal to give up, she was here. And she wasn't just here, she was dominating. She was showing every privileged, well-trained pianist in the competition what real music sounded like when it came from necessity rather than choice. Robert suddenly stood up. He didn't plan it, didn't think about it. His body just moved on its own. Thomas looked at him in surprise, and then understanding crossed his face. He stood up too. And then Catherine and Daniel. All the judges rising to their feet while Elena was still playing, something that simply wasn't done at formal competitions. But this wasn't a normal competition anymore. This had become something else, something bigger. The rules didn't seem to matter. The audience noticed the judges standing and began rising too, one by one, then in groups, then in a wave that swept across the entire concert hall. Hundreds of people standing, watching this 17-year-old girl from a small Croatian town pour her entire life into Rachmaninoff's masterpiece. Elena didn't notice. She was too deep in the music, too far gone to see the standing audience or the judges on their feet or the other competitors watching from the wings with wonder on their faces. She just kept playing, kept giving everything she had, racing toward the finish line that was now just moments away. Robert felt his heart pounding. His palms were sweaty. He realized he was more nervous now than Elena appeared to be. He wanted her to make it through, to finish strong, to nail those final triumphant chords that would bring this incredible journey to its conclusion. The music built and built, Elena's whole body rising slightly off the bench with the force of the sound she was creating. The final section of the piece arrived like a storm. Elena's hands moved across the keyboard with such speed and conviction that Robert wondered how the piano itself could withstand the force. Every chord rang out clear and true, every run of notes cascaded perfectly into the next. This was the moment where lesser pianists fell apart, where the combination of physical exhaustion and mental pressure finally caught up with them. Elena didn't fall apart. She blazed. Robert watched her hands and saw something he'd missed before. The calluses weren't just from hard work. They were positioned differently than on most pianists' hands. He'd played piano himself for 30 years before becoming a judge, and his calluses had formed in the typical places from regular practice on good instruments. But Elena's were scattered across her fingers in unusual patterns, marks left from compensating for broken keys, from learning to play at odd angles, from adapting to whatever damaged instrument she could find. Those calluses had become her secret weapon. They'd given her a strength and endurance that pianists who'd always had perfect instruments simply didn't possess. While others had learned to let the piano do some of the work, Elena had learned to command it completely. Every sound came from her will and her power, and her refusal to let anything stop her. The music swirled higher, and Elena attacked a particularly brutal passage that Robert had seen defeat countless competitors. It required both hands to cross over each other repeatedly while maintaining different rhythms. A coordination nightmare that looked physically impossible. Most pianists approached it carefully, slowing down slightly to make sure they got it right. Elena played it faster than the original tempo marking, and she didn't miss a single note. Someone in the audience actually gasped out loud. Robert couldn't tell who, and it didn't matter. He felt like gasping himself. What he was witnessing shouldn't have been possible. You didn't just teach yourself piano and then show up at an international competition and outplay people who'd had private lessons since they were 4 years old. That wasn't how this world worked. Except apparently it was. Because Elena was doing exactly that, right in front of everyone. Thomas leaned close to Robert, still on his feet like everyone else. "I've never seen anything like this," he said, his voice hoarse. "In 40 years of judging, I've never—" He trailed off, unable to finish. Robert understood. There weren't words for it. This was one of those moments that reminded you why you dedicated your life to music in the first place, why you sat through hundreds of adequate performances and dealt with difficult parents and filled out endless paperwork and traveled to competitions around the world. This was why. For the rare moments when someone came along who was truly special. Elena's face had transformed completely. Gone was any trace of the nervous girl who'd walked across the stage. In her place was an artist fully alive, fully present, channeling something bigger than herself. Her eyes were closed now, and she swayed with the music like a tree in wind, bending but never breaking. Robert noticed her lips were moving slightly, and he realized she was counting. Even in the middle of this incredible performance, part of her brain was still doing the practical work, keeping track of where she was in the piece, making sure she didn't lose her place in the complexity. It was the mark of someone who'd learned without a teacher, who'd had to develop her own methods for staying on track. The music built to an almost unbearable intensity. Robert felt like his heart might burst. The sound filled the concert hall so completely that it seemed to vibrate in his bones. This was what music was supposed to be, what it was meant to do. It wasn't just entertainment or technical display. It was communication at the deepest level, human soul speaking to human soul without the limitations of words. Around Robert, people were crying openly now, not polite, controlled tears, but real sobbing from multiple sections of the audience. A woman in the second row had her face in her hands. A teenager a few seats away was hugging herself, rocking slightly. Even some of the ushers standing along the walls had tears on their cheeks. This was more than just beautiful piano playing. Elena was telling her story through Rachmaninoff's notes. Every struggle, every moment of doubt, every time she'd wanted to give up but kept going anyway. Her father's death was in there, in those minor chords that ached with loss. Her mother's sacrifice was in the strong, steady bass notes that held everything together. Her siblings were in the playful little melodic figures that danced through the darker sections. And her own determination, her absolute refusal to let circumstances define her future, that was in every powerful chord and triumphant phrase. Robert thought about all the students he'd trained over the years, all the advice he'd given about practice techniques and performance psychology. He'd told them that music was about discipline and technique and proper form, and those things mattered, sure. But watching Elena now, he realized he'd been leaving out the most important part. Music was about having something to say and finding the courage to say it. Elena had plenty to say, and she was saying it loud enough for everyone to hear. The piece was racing toward its conclusion now, the final minute where everything came together in a magnificent display of skill and emotion. Robert knew this section note by note. He'd heard it played by masters, by professionals who'd devoted their entire lives to perfecting Rachmaninoff. Elena was 17 years old and self-taught, and she was holding her own against those memories. More than holding her own. She was creating a new standard, a new way of understanding what this music could be. Her hands flew up the keyboard in a glittering run of notes that seemed to climb into the sky, then down again in a thundering descent that shook the air. The piano sang and roared under her fingers, becoming an extension of her will. Robert had always thought of the piano as just an instrument, a tool for making music, but watching Elena, he saw it differently. In her hands, the piano was alive. It was a partner in telling this story, a voice crying out alongside her own. The final chords were approaching. Robert could feel it, could sense the music gathering itself for one last push. His entire body was tense, every muscle tight with anticipation. He wanted to see Elena succeed so badly it almost hurt. She'd come so far, overcome so much. She deserved this moment. She'd earned it with every hour of practice in that cold gymnasium, every sacrifice, every time she'd chosen music when it would have been easier to give up. Elena played a descending sequence of chords, each one landing with perfect weight and timing. Robert counted them in his head, knowing exactly how many were left. 5 more chords, then 4, then 3. Elena's entire body was engaged now, her back straight, her arms strong, her face showing the fierce concentration of someone giving absolutely everything they had. 2 chords left. The penultimate one rang out, full and resonant, holding for just the right amount of time. Then Elena raised her hands high, her fingers spread wide, preparing for the final chord. Robert held his breath. The entire audience held their breath. Even the air itself seemed to be waiting. Elena's hands came down with absolute confidence, with the certainty of someone who knew exactly who they were and what they were capable of. The final chord exploded through the concert hall, triumphant and perfect and true. She held it, let it ring out, let it fill every empty space and touch every heart. And then, slowly, she released the keys. The sound faded gradually, natural decay, the piano's final notes hanging in the air like something precious no one wanted to let go. Silence. Pure, complete silence filled the concert hall after that last note faded away. It was the kind of silence that felt sacred, like everyone knew they'd just witnessed something extraordinary and needed a moment to process it. Elena sat at the piano, her hands still hovering over the keys, her head bowed. Her shoulders rose and fell with deep breaths, and Robert could see her whole body trembling from the effort and emotion of what she'd just done. The silence stretched on. 3 seconds. 5 seconds. 10. It was unusual, this long pause. Normally audiences applauded right away, eager to show their appreciation. But this felt different. No one wanted to be the first to break the spell, to shatter the fragile beauty of what Elena had created. Then Robert did something he'd never done in 12 years of judging competitions. His hands came together in applause while the performance was still officially ongoing. Before the judges had conferred, before the formal protocols had been followed, the sound of his clapping echoed through the silent hall like a gunshot. And then the dam broke. The entire audience erupted. Not polite concert applause, not the measured appreciation of sophisticated music lovers. This was thunder. This was an explosion of emotion that had been building throughout Elena's entire performance and finally found its release. People jumped to their feet if they weren't standing already. The applause was deafening, rolling through the hall in waves that seemed to grow louder instead of softer. Elena's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. She looked out at the audience as if seeing them for the first time, as if she'd been so deep in the music that she'd forgotten where she was. Tears were streaming down her face. Not the quiet tears from during the performance, but full sobs of relief and disbelief and overwhelming emotion. She stood up from the piano bench, shaky and uncertain, and the applause somehow grew even louder. People were shouting, some were crying, others were hugging the strangers sitting next to them, united in what they'd just experienced. Robert saw the elderly woman in the front row standing with both hands pressed to her heart, her face radiant with joy. The man in the expensive suit was clapping so hard his hands must have hurt. Thomas grabbed Robert's shoulder, squeezing it hard. When Robert looked at him, he saw his old friend had tears running down his face. "I don't know what to say," Thomas managed. "I just don't know what to say." Robert didn't either. He just kept clapping, his hands starting to sting but not caring at all. Elena tried to bow, the way performers are supposed to do, but she was crying too hard. She covered her face with her hands for a moment, her whole body shaking. The audience's response only intensified, people calling out encouragement and praise. Someone threw flowers onto the stage, then someone else, until there was a small pile of bouquets near the piano. The ovation went on. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3. Robert checked his watch at the 4-minute mark, amazed. He'd seen standing ovations before, of course, but they usually lasted 30 seconds, maybe a minute for truly exceptional performances. This was something else entirely. The audience didn't want it to end. They wanted to hold on to this feeling, this moment, for as long as possible. Elena finally managed to compose herself enough to bow properly. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked out at the crowd with an expression of pure wonder, like she couldn't quite believe this was real. Then she did something that made Robert's heart clench. She placed both hands over her heart and mouthed the words, "Thank you," to the audience, so sincere and humble that several people near Robert started crying all over again. The applause continued for another minute before finally, gradually, beginning to fade. People sat down reluctantly, still buzzing with excitement, turning to their neighbors to share their reactions. Robert heard fragments of conversation around him. "Did you see? I've never heard. That was the most incredible." Elena walked off stage, still looking dazed. The moment she disappeared into the wings, Robert heard a collective sigh from the audience, as if everyone had been holding something in and could finally breathe. He sat down heavily in his seat, suddenly exhausted. Thomas collapsed next to him. "Well," Thomas said after a long moment, "I guess we know who won." Robert let out a laugh that was half sob. "Yeah, I guess we do." The competition continued, of course. There were still a dozen performers who had to take their turn, but it felt almost cruel to make them go on after Elena. How could anyone follow that? Robert tried his best to focus on each subsequent performance, to give them the attention they deserved, but his mind kept drifting back to Elena, to the power in her hands, the emotion in her playing, the way she'd transformed the entire atmosphere of the hall. During a break between performers, Robert stood up. "I need to do something," he told Thomas. "I'll be right back." He made his way backstage, flashing his judge's credentials at the security guard. The hallway was crowded with performers and their families, coaches, and competition staff. Robert pushed through, looking for Elena. He found her sitting alone in a corner, still in her black dress, staring at her hands like she couldn't quite believe what they'd just done. Robert approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Elena?" She looked up, her eyes red from crying, but also bright with something that looked like joy. "Yes?" He sat down next to her, suddenly unsure of what to say. "How do you apologize for almost dismissing someone's dreams? How do you admit you were completely wrong about something so important?" "I need to tell you something," he started. "When you first walked on stage, I didn't expect much. I looked at your application and made assumptions about you, about what you'd be capable of, and I was wrong, completely, utterly wrong." Elena listened, her expression open and kind. "What you did up there," Robert continued, his voice thick with emotion, "that was the most extraordinary performance I've heard in my entire career. Not just today, not just this year. In my entire life of listening to music, and I almost missed it, because I judged you before you played a single note." He paused, meeting her eyes. "I'm sorry for that, and I want you to know that I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure you get the opportunities you deserve. You shouldn't have to fight this hard for something you're so clearly meant to do." Elena's eyes filled with tears again, but she was smiling. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." They sat together for a few more minutes, not saying much, just sharing the quiet space. Eventually, Robert had to return to his judging duties, but before he left, Elena grabbed his hand. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. "Of course. I almost didn't come. To the competition, I mean. I couldn't afford the plane ticket, and I thought there was no point anyway. Who was I to compete against people who'd been training their whole lives with the best teachers? But my mother, she sold her wedding ring to buy my ticket. She told me that some chances only come once, and you have to take them even when you're scared." Robert felt his throat tighten. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She is," Elena agreed. "And I'm going to win this for her, for my family, for everyone who believed I could do this even when I didn't believe in myself." "You already won," Robert said gently. "The judge's decision is just a formality now." And it was. When the competition ended and the judges gathered to deliberate, there was no debate. For the first time in the competition's history, Elena received a perfect score from every single judge. Unanimous, unquestioned, absolute. Robert had the honor of announcing her victory. When Elena's name echoed through the hall, the audience erupted again, the applause nearly as loud as during her performance. She walked on stage to accept her award. And this time she wasn't nervous at all. She stood tall, proud, finally believing that she belonged there. Years later, Robert would tell this story to every new judge he trained. He'd pull out the recording of Elena's performance and make them listen. And he'd tell them about how he almost missed greatness because of his assumptions, and how that mistake taught him the most important lesson of his career. Talent doesn't always come in the package you expect. Sometimes it comes from broken pianos and borrowed time, from sacrifice and determination, and refusing to let the world tell you what you can't do. And if you're not careful, if you let your prejudices and assumptions cloud your judgment, you might miss something truly extraordinary. Elena went on to study at the Vienna Conservatory on a full scholarship that Robert personally arranged. She became one of the most celebrated pianists of her generation, performing in the world's greatest concert halls. But she never forgot where she came from. She started a foundation that provided instruments and lessons to children who couldn't afford them, giving them the chances she'd had to fight so hard for. And every time she performed, no matter how famous she became, Robert could still see that nervous 17-year-old girl walking across the stage. The one who taught him that greatness has nothing to do with circumstance and everything to do with heart.